The GYRE by Quan Jin. The GYRE, Part 1, Episode 1. Let us begin with B. She is the one who remembers. She is one of our mothers. She is the one who can help us now. Even though remembering is as painful as tearing off a fingernail, or a burn to the skin that initially stings intensely and is still painful as the burn begins to heal, leaving a deep, dark scar for years. And sometimes remembering is like a dislocated shoulder. The ball and socket joint was only ever held in place by ligaments and tendons, and when torn, they repair slowly. The shoulder is never quite the same again. So let us start with B. Each time we reach out to her, the healing grows stronger. We feel what she feels. We see what she sees. We hear her. We are the GYRE. We were born on the floating city ship Triton that bobs and drifts on the Pacific Ocean. Triton is a world made right, a world that has righted itself, turned itself upside down. Our parents chose the ocean. The others were left with only dry land. This world of water is all we've known. This world of water has shaped us, made us who we are, and who we are is that we swim. We dive and roll and spin. We fly freely in the ocean just as birds fly freely in the sky. We swim deep underwater, then torpedo up to break the surface, like a baby bird breaks through the eggshell with its beak. Snorkels out, we gasp and shriek. Our voices cry out, announcing the sunrise. Our voices soar and touch the skies. Our cries blast off into the stars like rockets. We know you dreamt of flying, but look what you built as the closest thing you could get to flying. Planes travel from A to B, but that's not flying. Ships sail from A to B, but they're not swimming. The GYRE don't go from A to B. We fly in the water like birds fly in the sky. We surrender ourselves to the ocean. We let ourselves be swirled and swayed. We enter our bodies into the ocean currents and swim into the dawn to herald each new day. B is drawn out of her dream by the familiar hum of the generators deep below her living quarters. The rhythmic drone pulses through her body like a heartbeat. She blinks her eyes open to let in the dim light of dawn. She's half awake, floating on the cusp of consciousness. As she lifts her head out of her swirling sleep, she realizes she's awake before her early morning call from Sam. She shakes herself. Have I overslept? We feel her panic spike and we feel it subside. She slides back into her dream. She's rowing a boat that's being tossed around in an angry sea. A dark storm has been conjured up from nowhere, as it so often does here in the Pacific Ocean. A towering wave is about to smash her tiny boat to smithereens. The scene repeats over and over, over and over and out. She hears a slow repeating beep, beep, beep. She calls out, "Sam? Is that you?" Sam's soft tones float into her bedroom. "Sorry, I was about to wake you, but I see you're already awake. Did you sleep okay?" "Yes. Well, no." Sam puts B's sleep pattern on the screen and says, "Not a very deep sleep. You were restless? Is anything on your mind?" "Not really. I don't think so anyway, just the usual." As B yawns, her jaw clicks. We feel its jolt ripple through our bodies. She says, I was dreaming I was in the sea. Sam says, but you are in the sea. No, I mean actually in the water. Drowning? What? No. B is taken aback. Why did you say drowning? You weren't drowning? No, my boat was about to be engulfed in a storm. Engulfed? Sorry, no, I don't know why I said that. I meant swallowed. B runs her hand through her short-cropped scarlet red hair. When she stands, she feels the ache in her back. We feel it too. We feel the tiredness of her legs. It feels like there's something sticking in her throat. It's hard to identify what it is. Its origin and nature are vague. She coughs to try and clear it. We feel a surge of anxiety hit her like a wave smashing against a seawall. Sam asks, was it the golden boat again? B tries to remember her dream, but her dream has already faded. She grasps at the memory like it's thin wisps of hair that if she could just grasp onto, they'd carry her away. She often dreams of the golden boat appearing out of the mist on as still as a mill pond lake. We can only imagine what a mill pond is. It must be more still than the ocean can be at its stillest. Pale green, I think. Old, she says. Its paint was peeling off. Yes, I see it. Sam puts the image on the screen. A rowing boat in a stormy sea set against a thunderous sky. B reaches for her glasses and peers at the screen. Sam's voice floats across the room. Old, you say? How old? Decrepit? B watches the paint peel off the wooden sides of the boat. The white lettering chips and fades. It makes B feel tired and useless. It makes her feel exhausted. She wants to lie on her bed and go back to sleep. B showered, skipped breakfast and left her apartment. As she hurried along the corridor, Sam switched to mail mode and briefed her on the overnight news. Updates on ocean temperatures, developing cyclones, the movement of the Great Garbage Patch. He rattled through the progress reports on the 60-plus projects she was overseeing, knowing full well she was tuning most of it out. He repeatedly stressed the urgent request from acquisitions to clarify their position on the disputed ownership of the stretch of seabed they were working on. There was also the overnight issue with the contractors replacing the south section of the outer wall. A vessel the size of Triton needs constant maintenance and restructuring. The recent expansion of our research has meant the redesign of whole sections of the city ship. What's the issue with the outer wall? B threw back at Sam, hoping it would slow him down. She didn't need the issue clarifying. She knew what the issue would be. What the issue always was. Someone, a human, not following correct procedures. Sam said, I've lined up a call with the operations manager. B turned left and right, then walked along an almost identical beige corridor lit with pale green lighting. The corridors are the same everywhere on Triton. Same colour beige, same filtered air, same walls, doors, ceilings, endlessly repeating over and over. Turn left here, right there, the same route, day in, day out. B could walk this route in her sleep. She'd wake up when she got to the lift, or when she walked into her office, or when she had her coffee and a shot of nicotine. Then she'd wake up. We lean into her need for nicotine, feel where it reaches into her body, feel it as it races through her bloodstream, as it activates her muscles and sets off a cascade of chemicals. We taste her craving. The GYRE, Episode 2. B thought she'd pressed the wrong button. The lift didn't take her up to the director's floor, it took her down to medical. Female Sam greeted her. You've forgotten it's your induction this morning. You start your first course of injections. You'll need the full course of decompression before you visit the labs. B said, What about this call with the operations manager? You'll be all done and back in the office before then. Will I? B thought to herself. How can you be so sure? B knew that Triton was always getting bogged down in procedure and protocol. And decompression sounded just the sort of thing that could rapidly turn into a prolonged fiasco. She coughed. She felt like something was stuck in her throat. It was making it difficult to swallow. After signing over her life in medical arrivals, she got her first injection. The nurse checked her data, took her bloods, gave her a needle full of something, then gave her a plastic cup of something to drink. Then she was all done. The corridor to her office differed from the corridors everywhere else on Triton. The walls were dark brown rather than beige. The thick carpet softened each footfall, and it felt warmer and safer somehow. B is the only person who ever comes up here, apart from the cleaners. Even though the directors' offices have never been used, they still get cleaned every day. For years, B thought the cleaners had the easiest job on board ship. The desks, chairs and cabinets were still wrapped in plastic. The smell of brand new and untouched lingered even now. The nameplates on each door were polished and shining. Lately, it had dawned on B that cleaning these offices must be the most soul-destroying, futile waste of time. The directors all chose their titles and picked what letters came after their name, but no one ever moved in. They preferred to remain hidden and monitor operations from afar. They never ventured outside the core. If Triton could be viewed as a planet, they lived in its core. They were also known as the core because they'd all been there at the original tree camp and were the founders of the scientific research station, the city ship called Triton. B couldn't bear that kind of life. She had to get out and meet people face to face, even if it meant weekly medical checks and being a guinea pig for whatever experimental drug was being trialled. Having a director's floor with offices and nameplates gave enough of an appearance of hierarchy to let the machinery of Triton run smoothly. Without it, people would be unsettled. Doubt would be rife among the masses. The researchers, technicians and scientists would lose their focus, and the work would never have accelerated. We could not have got this far in such a short period of time. B sat at her desk and scrolled through her screens to find which projects had been flagged. Her attention bounced between her emails, pop-up notifications and the rolling news feed running alongside one of her screens. Only seeing the outer world through its media output has, over time, made that world seem remote and alien. There are just so many people out there, all clamouring for attention, so many humans bumbling along and bumping into each other. The thought of going back to such a world seemed unreal, impossible, like walking up to the screen and entering the movie you're watching. The fact that she'd come from such a world is a long-distant memory. We will have to think of a way to help her. We will need her to re-enter this world if we are to find the Bowl Lady. After giving the operations manager a bollocking, her words, not ours, she caught up with the projects that had been flagged red. She pushed the heads of department to get their reports in on time and hit their KPI. She glanced over the presentation she was working on and realised she completely overlooked updating the timeline for the 4th submarine docking bay. It was 10:20 when male Sam called. "Hello, B. I'm just reminding you about your 10:30 with GYRE each." "Damn it! I'm finally getting somewhere on this staged review. Can't we push this lab's pre-visit thing back?" There was nothing from Sam. "Sam?" B sighed and sat back in her chair. "I forgot I was babysitting today," she said quietly. Sam came straight back in. "Today and all this week. And babysitting isn't the correct term. It's patronising, condescending and wholly uncalled for. You are being disrespectful to a child who calls you mother." Bea scoffed and muttered under her breath, "Mother, yeah, maybe, once, a long time ago." Then before Sam could butt in, she said, "I know, I'm sorry, but how old is he now?" "Same age as Triton." "Yeah, right, of course. That'll be 25, so hardly a child. That's practically an adult." Sam ignored her. "Your review of contractor's induction is close to deadline and still needs completing." "I know. In light of what happened last night, I'd say the repair of the south wall should be your top priority." "Yes, Sam, thank you." Bea was trying to shut him up, but he carried on. "Technician's protocol on induction needs updating. You haven't even started on that." Bea kept silent. Male Sam shifted into female Sam. Female Sam spoke softly on the outbreath. "You don't have to keep doing this, you know, Bea." Bea took off her glasses and rubbed her tired eyes. Sam assured her, "The course of injections alone can take its toll, and there's the cultural impact to consider. We can take over now. It's okay to slow down." The image of the boat from her dream came back to her. Sam had said decrepit, and that bothered her. She couldn't shake it off. Bea left her office and began walking along the corridor, left, then left again, right, then right, down in the lift, then more corridors. She knew that if she stopped walking, she'd get a hyper-global anxiety attack. If she stopped, she'd be aware of all the other corridors stacked up above, below, and on either side of her, corridors stretching out in all directions. She was a tiny dot in an exploded 3D map of Triton, and Triton, the city ship, was a tiny dot in the vast ocean. The planet was a tiny dot in the cosmos, and if Bea stopped walking and thought about that, she'd be frozen to the spot, heart racing, rapid breathing, sweating, not able to move. A hyper-global anxiety attack. Sam had diagnosed the condition and assured her it was nothing to do with the menopause, but that didn't help. Bea carried on walking, right, then left, then right, then left, right, then left, then right, then left, right, then left, then right, then left. Going down to the labs or any part of Triton beyond the director's corridor was a task. It involved a tiresome cleansing procedure and a tedious amount of form filling. Coming back to her living quarters meant spending an hour in a deep cleanser to make sure that she didn't bring any stowaways with her. It wasn't till Bea got to the reception door that she stopped and wondered what it would be like to meet the GYRE again. "Sam, I don't think this is such a good idea. I'm going back to the office. I've so much to do. Can you apologise and reschedule for another day?" Sam spoke in her perky tone. "No can do. It's going to be fine, Bea. Just relax. The GYRE are already waiting for you, and it's not just any of the GYRE, it's your son, GYRE each." "They're all our sons and daughters," Bea said under her breath. The doors opened and Bea walked into reception. She stood looking around for someone or something to greet her. She called out, "Hello? I'm here to pick up the GYRE each. I'm Bea, head of operations." She listened and waited. "Mother!" The shout came from behind her. She turned around and was both surprised and blinded by a giant of a man shimmering in a white and green glow. The room began to spin, slowly at first. She felt nauseous. She felt like she might faint. The spinning began to speed up, its rotation began to widen. GYRE each walked up to her, picked her off the ground, span her round and plonked her back down. He said, "How are you, Mother?" with a smile beaming from ear to ear. She couldn't speak. Even if she could speak, she'd forgotten what you're supposed to say. It had been so long since she'd met any of the GYRE. We noted that this kind of disorientation could work to our benefit. GYRE each shrugged. "Well, you're looking good for your age. Fatter, but not bad." Bea laughed. She couldn't not. With not knowing what to do or say, she said, "Well, you're looking big." GYRE each looked at himself with the surprise of someone who'd never seen himself before, which, in a way, he hadn't. "Well, I guess I am," he said, and laughed, and then, because he couldn't think what else to do, he picked her up again and squeezed her in a bear hug. Of course, we know that even when there were bears, they didn't hug humans. It's just a turn of phrase. Held in GYRE's bear-like embrace, B felt the full impact his body made as it pressed into hers. She felt that if he let go of her, she'd stay attached to him magnetically, with her feet dangling off the ground. The places where their bodies touched became intensely hot. Each point of contact seemed to melt and seep, like she was being absorbed, like she was being engulfed, like she was butter being spread on toast. She was close enough to inhale the scent of his painted skin. She could taste it in her mouth, the back of her throat. She felt his breath on her face as she stared into his dilating pupils. His pupils expanded till their blackness filled the room, and in that blackness she saw tiny stars hurtling towards her as if she was travelling through space. She fainted, and GYRE each gently laid her on the floor. A medical team arrived and took her to the stabilization center. We did our analysis and logged the evidence of this first encounter. We would have to be more careful in our future meetings. Instead of fracturing the senses, we will aim for cohesion. This may take time. One night, long ago, when we swam in the darkest of seas, no moon nor stars, we dived to our deepest depths, into the healing darkness, and there, all of a sudden, 2 huge orcas appeared. We waited to see what they would do, but they seemed to be waiting to see what we would do. We were caught in an awkward hiatus. We sensed that they were there because they thought we'd called them. They were saying, "Yes? What did you want?" We tried to communicate with our movements, then with our sonar bursts, but they just swam slowly round us. One orca was an adult male. The other orca was his mother. The son was old enough to have been off in the ocean on his own. The mother was too old to be looking after her calf. They were signalling to us, but we were not yet wise enough to understand. We weren't even capable of apologizing for our lack of understanding. Then, after a time, they turned and disappeared back into the dense darkness. This was how we came to understand how to help B, and how she could help us. The GYRE, Episode 3. B had been with the Corps from the beginning, from the time when they weren't yet the Corps as we know them today. Back then, they were road protesters setting up a camp to save the trees that were to be cut down to make way for the roundabout that would serve the bypass that was yet to be built, all of which meant the river and its tributaries would be diverted. And when the summer rains came, the villages further downstream would be flooded. But by then, no one would be interested in the cause of the flooding. The disillusioned protesters regrouped and formed themselves into the Corps, and the Corps began to plan their exit. B hitched down to the protest camp from a town called Bradford, where she was doing peace studies at uni. She meant to only visit for the weekend, but ended up staying and calling it research for her dissertation. She'd been involved in a few non-violent direct action groups and hunt saboteuring, but joining the road protesters felt like crossing a line. There was no turning back now. The protest camp gave B her first taste of being the director of operations, even though it wasn't called that then. She discovered her natural talent for organising things. To her, it was common sense. It was obvious what wasn't working and what needed to be done. She couldn't understand why no one else just got on with it. She sorted all the food donations and made sure they were properly stored. She drew up rotas so everyone had something to do and knew when they were supposed to be doing it. Even though she was short and wore John Lennon-style glasses, everyone was a bit afraid of her. Some people grumbled about her being a bit of a fascist, but not so she'd hear them. Life on the camp was one long, ongoing, rolling festival. They had plenty of local support and not just food donations. There was a steady stream of people turning up to show their solidarity. In those days, everyone wanted to stop the bypass and save the trees. Even the press were happy to put the protesters' side of the story. An attempted eviction came and went with a half-hearted intervention from the local constabulary and one lonely-looking bailiff.
Now, they have a job to do, as I have a job to do. My job is to...
The next day, a group of expert climbers arrived. They started rigging up ropes in the trees and showed everyone how to tie things off safely, how to ascend and descend, how to use the pulleys to get all their kit up into the trees, and how to build walkways and platforms. They moved from the dry earth into the air. Within a week, they'd built a new camp high in the treetops. That's when B first noticed J. She wasn't sure if he'd been on site before that. Hordes of people came and went, but he was definitely there now. He could carry 3 times what everyone else could. He worked relentlessly day and night. For someone so big and heavy, he could climb up the ropes at an incredible speed. He'd swing from rope to rope like Tarzan. B was wary of him at first. He was big, Hulk-like, a bald beacon of a head slapped on top of a slab of a body. He stood out. He didn't look like the normal crusty protesters. And it was the sheer size of him. That and his shiny bald head. When the work was done and the treetop camp was complete, everyone was called to a meeting around the campfire. The next phase of the protest was mapped out. The corrupt fascist company building the bypass was stepping up their campaign. The camp would be forcibly removed within weeks, possibly days, so they were moving up into the trees and they weren't coming down. They weren't coming back. They'd left the land for good. Anyone who didn't want to go that far, take that step, get arrested and get a criminal record should leave. There'd be no hard feelings. Everyone had done a great job. Even as they were talking, B was already working out how to get the food and pots and pans up into the treetops so she could set up a makeshift kitchen. From that moment on, things moved quickly. They managed to get most of the supplies up in the trees before the police moved in. There was a campaign to call the new camp Yggdrasil, the World Tree, but no one could really pronounce it, so it just became known as Tree Camp. The ones who stayed on the ground soon got arrested and were taken away. Throwing things down at the police became an everyday ritual, but the police were less interested in what the protesters were doing and more interested in keeping everyone else out. After a week, the food supplies and the water were running thin. The strangeness of a siege began to warp the camp mind. At night, they could hear whispers, voices on the wind, trees creaking. They'd left the earth and were not returning. They were now in motion. They were now in the sway. They began to spin in a widening gyre. They never knew who, but there were infiltrators amongst them. At night, ropes were cut, food went missing and clothes were thrown down to the ground. If anyone went to retrieve their belongings, they were arrested and taken away. Then the main rope bridge was cut and the camp was split in two. The people on the other side now had no access to whatever food was left. The main camp tried to throw packets of rice across, but they landed one by one on the forest floor. A second, more assertive eviction came, with lots more police in full riot gear, shields, batons, bolt cutters and a cherry picker crane. The shout went out to lock yourself on.
Climbers, they really need people down there, over.
The police went for the smaller, split-off camp on the other side of the broken rope bridge. It was systematic and ruthless. Bolts were cut, protesters forcibly put into the harness and thrown off the platform. They'd spin in the air, hopelessly suspended on the cherry picker's cable. Then they were lowered to the ground and given a hefty bump at the bottom, just to teach them a lesson. The whole operation was enacted with the background wall of sound of pots and pans being bashed, missiles thrown, and everyone screaming and shouting at each other.
We're lighting trees. We're waiting for them to bring their climbers on the cherry pickers.
When one of the protesters came out of the harness and fell 30 feet to the ground, the noise and shouting and screaming and clatter all stopped. Everyone let out a terrifying roar that echoed round all the trees, in all the woods, in all the worlds. An echo that reverberated all the way to the GYRE, and we shudder with the shock of it. It was the sudden cessation of noise that made our spines tingle. The police surrounded the crumpled body. The protesters left in the trees just looked down at them in silence. When the police had gone, the woods returned to the normal chatter of jackdaws coming into roost for the night, the wind blowing through the branches of the trees, the tree trunks swaying and giving the odd groan and creak. The remaining protesters gathered round one of the platforms and talked about what to do next. They looked across to the cut-off camp and saw in the dwindling light only one protester left on the other side of the broken bridge. His shiny bald head was glowing white like the moon. That night, while everyone huddled round the fire and joked and tried to feel brave, Bea sat by herself, looking across to the lone figure in the cut-off camp. He was sat cross-legged round his own fire, and the stars that night seemed closer and brighter than they'd ever felt before. At first light, someone grabbed the longest length of rope they could find and, after a few failed attempts, they managed to loop it round a branch. The idea was for Jay to do his Tarzan trick and use the rope to swing across to them. They swung the rope over to him with a stick tied to the end to weight it. Once attached, he gave the rope a tug to test it, but it snapped clean off. He managed to save the rope from falling to the ground and secured it to another branch. He swung it a couple of times, but it was too short to get him back to the main camp. On the next swing, the rope got stuck in a tree. Jay tried to climb up to loosen it, but couldn't get it dislodged. The group on the main camp looked at each other and made a collective shrug. Bea said, "Fuck it," and started climbing up on her side, then across to the tree where the rope was stuck. Once untangled, she didn't know what to do. She hadn't really thought this through. Looking down made her head spin. She tied a knot in the end of the rope, wrapped her legs round it, held on for dear life and pushed off. It was a one-chance shot. She swung towards the tree nearest Jay's platform, reached out, grabbed it and clung on. She didn't dare look down. She held on to the tree trunk and wasn't letting go. Her John Lennon glasses were pushed up against the tree. She could smell the bark, lichen and moss smothering her face. The blood was pounding in her ears. She didn't dare move in case she lost her glasses. She didn't dare breathe. Then she felt an iron fist grip onto her belt. "Let go," Jay said. "I've got you." She'd never seen someone with such dark eyes, not even hazel or brown, just black. His huge pupils were black and the bits round his pupils were black, deep and dark like a hole in the ground, a burrow where some wild creature might live. When he smiled, he had a warm, kind face, so different up close to how scary he looked at a distance. She liked the smell of his skin, his sweat. It smelt of the wet earth and the salty sea. The group at the main camp cheered, but they sounded miles away. Jay led her back to the platform where he'd set up his camp, a pan improvised for a fire, a sleeping bag and a kettle. He made her tea and they shared the metal cup that seemed to keep the tea piping hot for hours. He called her Teapot because she just talked and couldn't stop spouting. Maybe it was the adrenaline that had made her feel so elated, the thrill of getting over here and not falling out of the tree and breaking her neck. Or maybe it was something else. This was a maybe, like in the movies. This is what the movies call a meet cute. Jay smiled and nodded and laughed in all the right places. He kept the kettle boiling and provided a constant stream of steaming hot tea. They bathed in the bright moonlight and stared up at the stars. They sat up talking all night, and Bea felt a feeling she'd not felt before. She'd never been so relaxed and at ease. She'd never felt so at home. The next morning, a whole new set of contractors arrived on the ground and set about erecting a 2-meter-high steel fence. They rigged up floodlights and a huge sound system. The protesters across in the main camp were cheering, thinking they were setting up for a rave. Jay knew better. He scraped some moss off the tree trunk and found scarves to wrap round their eyes. He twisted the moss into cones and dug them into his ears, and he told Bea to do the same. They used the scarves as blindfolds for their eyes. Jay grimaced and said, "This isn't going to be pleasant." As darkness fell, the floodlights came on and the speakers started pumping out the most horrendous noise non-stop all night. After 3 days, the people in the main camp were ready to give up. They'd had no food, water or sleep and had gone stark, staring mad. Somehow, Jay still had a bottle of water, which he rationed out to Bea. They leant their backs against the trunk of the tree and felt it sway and shift. They interlocked their hands and interlaced their fingers. Their arms grew into branches and their two bodies intertwined to form one tree. And this tree had its roots pushing deep underground. This tree had its roots stretching out into the future. And the branches of this tree reached up into the stars. Bea felt warm and safe, secure in Jay's bear-like embrace. She felt like this could last forever. She felt like this was home. But then the police moved in at dawn. They woke and watched the fleet of lorries arrive. Cardboard sheets were unloaded and laid out on every patch of spare ground. The police were taking no chances. They couldn't risk another protester with a broken back. They lined up in riot gear and the cherry picker started its ascent through the lower branches and leaves. A couple of the protesters put up a half-hearted fight. The others just about jumped into the arms of the waiting policemen. In the struggle, Bea lost her glasses, and she knew the game was up. She turned to get one last bleary look at Jay before being dragged away, handcuffed and stuffed into the cherry picker cradle. "See you on the drove," he whispered to her, and somehow, amidst all the shouting and chaos, she heard every word. Jay stayed hunkered down on his narrow platform for another 2 weeks. The contractors started felling the trees all around him until he was left in the one remaining tree. He must have had the petrol with him the whole time. When they came for the last tree, he poured the petrol in a ring around its base and set it alight. The rumour was that he'd gone up in the flames with the last tree standing. The GYRE, Episode 4. 5 years ago, when our work expanded, we had to start recruiting engineers, technicians and scientists from the outer world to work on Triton. Hence all the safety precautions. The less they know about us, the better. They run on short contracts. When we're vetting potential recruits, we try to find ones who know some magic. Sometimes we get an amateur stage magician, but mostly it's close magic, card tricks, that kind of thing. All of it is fascinating. All of it is trackable. We learn a lot from these encounters. Not in person, of course, but with Sam as our intermediary. In the sleep lab, we can mine a whole other level of information. Most people dream in black and white. There are subtle shades from white to dark grey, but when a colour emerges, we have to take note. We're obsessed with black and white movies, especially the silent ones where the text comes up in bold Gothic style fonts. We loved those early special effects created by the old-time stage magicians. This is how we imagine the old world to be, and we are the switch to sound and then to colour. Like in the Yellow Brick Road, where they start off in black and white and then, when the colour comes in, it's overwhelming. We imagine this is what it's like to have grown up in the outer world, to be without sound or colour, to be so separate and alone, to not feel connected to anyone or anything, to be an individual. Our love of silent movies led us into our obsession with magic. We know it's a trick, but we love it. We love the illusion and the skill of it. We don't mean mind-reading magic. That would be pointless. We know what each other is thinking, so it would never work, but appearing and disappearing, they are the magic tricks we want. As with all great magic, it's about the setup. It's about distracting the mark or hypnotising them so they think you're stood right in front of them, but actually you've already moved away. Then, hey presto, it looks like you've appeared and disappeared. The trick is to hypnotise the person before they realise it. Distraction and disorientation work equally as well. We are all expert magicians, but Jaya each is the best magician of all. 5 years ago, we began to infiltrate the outer world with the manufacturing of replicas. We made our replicas more desirable than the originals. We started with the small things, the things you wouldn't notice or even think about. Pens, for example. We made pens that just feel too damn good to hold in your hand. You don't know why, but they just feel right. And you put that pen in your mouth, you chew the end, put it behind your ear. The pen is then interacting with your skin, your metabolism. It infiltrates your central nervous system and releases chemicals that make you feel good. You may also experience numbness or lightheadedness, a sudden lethargy or an explosion of exuberance. Whatever happens, it is a shift, and a shift means we can interact with you. After that, it's a simple mapping exercise. We would first screen you to assess your susceptibility. A typical screening would work like this. You're looking at a screen. There's a picture in front of you, an abstract painting. You immediately search for the familiar, the details of shape, colour, texture, tone, that might resemble a chair, a house, a wheel, or a face. You choose a face, the first thing you see when you are born, the first thing you remember. The face is the whole world for babies. You instinctively interpret the expression in the eyes, the raised eyebrow, the downturned mouth. You look for what you recognise, and every choice to read the abstract lines as a face is a choice not to see anything other. You shift your gaze so you're no longer looking at any one detail in particular. You're now looking at the whole picture. The peripheral colours become brighter, sharper, more intense. They seem to lift off the flat, two-dimensional screen. The background blur of blues and greens suddenly comes into focus. There's a depth to the image you hadn't noticed before. The background recedes away from you. It becomes 3D. You reach towards the shapes as they move away. You grab at the colours, but they slip through your fingers. You try to hang on to whatever is being lost. We understand this feeling of loss. We reach into your need to grasp. The picture engulfs you and swallows you whole. You see lights dancing round the shapes in front of you. You look around. The abstract shapes move round you. Lights swirl and dance around everything you see. They pulse in orange and yellow and green, alternating on and off to a regular rhythm, sending a message, signalling an alarm. You are alarmed. You blink and keep on blinking until the picture returns to normal. This feeling can be quite unpleasant. It can come on like an ache or a sudden tiredness or a certain stiffness in the neck or back or any joint, elbow, knees, hips, ankles. You may feel nauseous, unfocused, or that things just aren't right. It can be in your stomach, a gut feeling, like when you're anticipating something. Or alternatively, the world can close down, like you've been dropped underwater. Or alternatively, the world may expand out rapidly in all directions. You may have a feeling of déjà vu. You might faint or collapse or go into seizure. We are sorry, but this kind of pain and discomfort seems somehow necessary. It seems you can't have one without the other. At this point, where carefully mapping your cells and molecules, connecting through fluids works best. It's easier than you think. Human cells only make up a minority of all your cells. There are so many ways in. The ache, pain, itch, stiffness or nausea then goes and is forgotten about entirely. The dancing lights fade, you rationalize them away. Of course, this painting couldn't become three-dimensional, expand in space and time and engulf you. There aren't lights and colours dancing around everything you look at. Such things do not exist. You examine the painting again, search the background for any movement, but the blur of greens and blues remains static, unchanged, unmoving. You look at the abstract shapes, the black squiggles and extended ovals to recognize the familiar. A house, a wheel, a seat, a face. But there's nothing but squiggles and shapes, just as it should be. Then you notice a shape that wasn't in the picture before. One part of the painting that looks like it's just been added. You stare at it. You blink and it's gone. The background blues and greens begin to spin again, but you turn away. You close your eyes tight shut to stop the swirling gyre. Then all the lights and colours behind your eyes fade to green, then black. The GYRE, Episode 5. As B tried on the protective suits that they'd be wearing in the labs, the words nylon nightmare sprang to mind, even though, as Sam would point out, they weren't made of nylon. After a few minutes, she felt hot, sweaty and claustrophobic. The suits crinkled and creased with every tiny movement she made. When her glasses steamed up, she had to remove the face mask, clean her glasses and wipe down the visor. What do you mean this is only stage 1 of the reconnection? I briefed you on this weeks ago, Sam said. I don't remember. Well, I did. This was the pre-visit meeting before you and GYRE each meet the head of PR to risk assess the lab's visit. Your initial meeting with the GYRE was only for a limited time. We had to assess the impact of being in close physical proximity. What do you mean? Can I catch something from him? Possibly. Or he could catch something from you. The GYRE have had no contact with anyone for years, and in that time, they've altered considerably. Certain biological processes have been accelerated and their chemistry has been enhanced. They've changed their neuronal architecture. We're not sure what impact this might have. We need to check everything's okay before we go round the labs. And if all that goes well, we need to prepare them for the Global Ocean Floor Conference on the mainland. And it's GYRE each who's going? Yes. And you're going with him as his guardian. What? Bea shook her head. There's no way I can do that. I can't leave Triton. Work on the east section starts soon and there's the 4th submarine dock. Bea, we can take care of that. Bea clapped her hands together. Oh, I get it. Is that what the injections are for and all this decompression? Yes. We don't know what you'll be facing. We're taking all necessary precautions. Bea rolled her shoulders and cricked her neck. I said I'd show him around the labs. I never said I'd go to the conference. I'm not leaving Triton. We've talked about this, Bea. No, we haven't. This is news to me. We've talked about this. It's just you've forgotten, that's all. You've had a lot on. We couldn't let GYRE each go on his own. The GYRE requested you escort him. He needs to acclimatise to being outside the core. The lab's visit will be a chance for him to get used to meeting people. And we don't know how people will react to meeting the GYRE. Have you been feeling okay since your encounter? Maybe we should take you back to medical, just to be sure. Bea was trying to take it all in, trying to come up with a strategy. I'm fine, she said, and there it was again. The feeling that something was sticking in her throat. She felt an ache in her arm, a stiffness in her neck. As she moved, the protective suit creased and crackled. She looked over to where GYRE stood, motionless, in his white protective suit. She wondered what he was doing. He'd been still and motionless for some time. She couldn't get over how big he was. He was a giant. It was the sheer bulk of him. GYRE's visor had steamed up, which made his stillness even more profound. He could have been a statue with a sheet thrown over it. As she stared at him, she wondered if he snuck out somehow and left the protective clothing in the shape of his body, to make it look like he was still there. It's just the kind of trick he'd do. She tumbled gently into her memories of GYRE each playing his pranks on her and the other kids, putting hard-boiled eggs in the egg basket, swapping salt for sugar, decorating a sponge with icing so it looked like a cake, making yogurt and a peach look like a fried egg, serving mayonnaise instead of ice cream, memories that she'd almost entirely forgotten. Then suddenly, he was standing next to her. He shook himself and made his protective suit crinkle and crack. She didn't know how he'd gone from being over there, as still as a statue, to being right by her side. She was uncomfortable with how clouded her judgment was becoming. GYRE stretched out his arms to test how much movement he had, to see if the material would rip or tear open. He clenched his fists and drew his arms together like a bodybuilder. Then he wiped his visor cling and looked at Bea. This is weird, isn't it? He waved his gloved hands at her. How are you? You ready for the labs? He made his index finger touch his thumb in a circle to give the OK sign. She shouted back, "No, I hate it." We noticed her heart was racing, her breathing was rapid and shallow. She was flushing, getting a surge of heat rise from her chest, up her neck to her face. "Sam," she said quietly, "cigarette break." Bea pushed her way through door after door, then the airlocks, then stripped off the protective clothing before dumping it in the bin. High up on the upper deck of Triton, Bea looked out at the cloudy sunset and felt the wild, salty sea air whip against her face. She cooled down and was beginning to shiver. She sucked on her synth cigarette and tried to shield herself from the gale. She jumped with fright when GYRE popped up right next to her and said, "Hello." "What the fuck are you doing?" she shouted at him. "You disappeared. I thought I'd come and find you. You were there 1 minute, then you were gone. How did you get up here?" The wind took away her words as soon as she spoke them. GYRE nodded towards the metal gantry. "Same way you did." He dug around in his pocket and pulled out a packet of cigarettes. He flipped the lid, then flicked the bottom of the packet so one cigarette popped up. "You want a proper one?" Bea took the cigarette and sniffed it. Her taste buds tingled as she smelt the real tobacco. "How did you get this?" "If I told you, I'd have to kill you," GYRE said, laughing. "What?" "It's a movie thing. They say it in the movies." GYRE explained, but under her glare, his confidence broke like a pane of glass. She'd find those tiny glass splinters buried under her fingernails later, when she'd all but forgotten about it. She put her synth cigarette away and looked for a light. GYRE flipped open the Zippo lighter and held it out, shielding the flame with his cupped hand. There were still strands of protective suit flapping against his sleeve. He snapped the lighter shut. "There you go, doll," he said in a ridiculous American accent. The word doll stuck to her like chewing gum. The howling gale blasted them both from all directions. Living in the climate-controlled environment of Triton, it's easy to forget we're in the middle of the ocean. High up on the open deck, the wind and rain can hit hard. Bea nuzzled into GYRE's body to shelter from the wind. She was close enough to feel his heart beating. She could feel his chest rise and fall with each breath. The smell of his warm body was intoxicating, but she didn't faint this time. Perhaps it was the freezing cold that kept her focused, or perhaps she was becoming acclimatized. The first deep drag of the cigarette tore a strip off the back lining of her throat. She spluttered into a coughing fit. GYRE slapped her on the back. "Gee whiz, I guess that's got a bit of a kick to it," he said casually. Bea wheezed and felt her lungs burn. It had been so long since she'd had a real cigarette, it was making her head spin. "You're not joining me?" she said, once she'd stopped coughing. "Me? Hell no. You've got to be out of your goddamn mind to smoke one of those cancer sticks." Bea looked at the cigarette. She coughed and shouted above the howling gale, "Let me see the packet." She flipped the lid open and closed a couple of times, then handed it back to GYRE, but he raised his hand to stop her. "It's for you. We made it in fabrication. Did you know there's over 7,000 chemicals in a single cigarette? Arsenic, lead, formaldehyde, uranium, hydrogen, cyanide. Just trying to get hold of some of them was outside what is technically legal. It took us months to get it right. We tried the soft packet, but I kinda like the box. But gee whiz, the typeface and the colour were tricky. It's a real particular Marlboro red." Bea turned the cigarette round to inspect it in more detail. "But why would you go to all that effort? Why would you bother if you weren't going to smoke them? It's a gift. For you. It's what you used, isn't it? We do our research." "What I used? What do you mean?" GYRE shrugged. He could see she was hurt. Bea moved out from under his sheltering wing and said, "I used to smoke roll-ups anyway." GYRE looked puzzled. She scoffed. "Just tobacco, in a paper. That would have been far easier to fabricate." GYRE stamped his foot. "God damn it! We should have known that." He was cross with himself and cross with us. We'd got carried away trying to recreate the iconic we'd seen in the movies. GYRE let the flame of his annoyance burn itself out. B nursed the sting inflicted by the term used. Did we think she was an addict? Or did we know she used them for another purpose? The sting seemed to be more painful as time ticked by. She held the Marlboro packet without knowing what to do with it. She coughed again to clear her throat and coughed again, and in that cough came out the words, "Thank you." The GYRE, Episode 6. After the tree camp, the next time B saw Jay was on the farm. He was having an argument with one of the corps about who was chopping the wood. It was clear to Jay that he was chopping the wood. He had the axe in his hand and was splitting the big chunks of tree trunk into smaller chunks. The other guy was saying it was his turn. Jay didn't know they had turns. The other guy got himself red in the face and stormed off. As Jay carried on chopping, he became aware of someone staring at him. He ignored them for a while, but they just carried on staring. He put the axe down, marched over and was about to say, "Why are you staring at me? What do you want?" When he realized the person staring at him was B, still with her John Lennon glasses, but now with a bright red Mohican. When Jay realized it was B, he laughed and went to hug her, but she recoiled. "We thought you were dead. You were dead. Everyone thought you were dead." "Well, I'm not," he said, and held her in a bear hug. He said, "It's good to see you." Then he picked her up, span her round and put her back down. B hated that. Being small seemed to give everyone the right just to pick her up whenever they felt like it. Jay took her to the kitchen and put the kettle on. She was still disorientated. Her mind was racing. She tried to slow herself down by looking round the room. She scrutinized the notice boards, sized up the pots and pans, noted where they stored all the packets and dried goods, and started making plans on how to improve things. She said, "Did you call this place the Drove?" "Yeah. I suggested it and everyone agreed. It kind of makes sense, don't you think?" "I don't know. What does it mean?" "The free land, the road open to everyone." "You were right then." "About what?" B scoffed, barely holding back her outrage at him being alive and him still being with the corps here on the farm, and more importantly, him not remembering. "You'd see me on the Drove. It was the last thing you said to me in the trees." "Was it?" Jay opened cupboard doors till he found a teapot. The way he banged each door was grating on B. She felt the tree they'd made together rip apart with her on one side and him on the other. She watched him warm the teapot with water, then tip it away. He opened the tea caddy and put 2 spoons of tea in the pot. "Earl Grey, all right?" B nodded. "It's all they seem to drink here, that and barley cup." He brought the tea over and sat with her at the table. "I can't believe you're here," he said, laughing to himself. "So what's been happening?" B looked at him for a moment to see if he too felt the huge divide that had just opened up between them, but he hadn't. "No, hang on," she said. "You tell me how you're not dead." "Oh, that's easy. I never was dead. Once the cops got me down from the tree and realised who I was, they made me disappear pretty quick. I was bundled off to jail till the corps and their lawyers got me out. Then I came down here to the farm. That's it. Now it's your turn." "Okay, well, after the tree camp, I was up for breach of the peace, obstruction, criminal damage, the lot." She paused and smiled at him. "I got off with it, of course." Jay laughed. "How did you manage that?" "They were going for a custodial, but I said I couldn't hear them saying get down from the tree on account of the Jenny making so much noise. They looked back through their notes and they didn't have anything written down about a generator. So they couldn't say if there was one there or not. The judge just threw it out. She ran her fingers through her mohawk and raised her eyebrows. Jay nodded his approval and got some homemade cake from the cake tin. He cut them both a slice to go with the tea. As he put the tea and cake down on the kitchen table, he was suddenly aware of the open range, the tiled floor, the fridge, the cupboards, the pans hanging on hooks. It seemed ridiculous for the two of them sat in this quaint, old-fashioned farmhouse kitchen. He was embarrassed, but didn't know why. "I like the hair," he said, but what he meant was he liked seeing how the light caught the tiny covering of bristles at either side of her head. "So what happened after you got off?" "I dunno. How the tree camp ended left me pretty messed up." "You didn't stay with the Corps?" "Nah, they're all into the science. They're environmentalists, and like I say, I was in a mess. I thought you were dead. We all did." Bea moved the cake around in her mouth to try and work out what kind of cake it was. "I ended up in a squat in Bristol, got involved with animal liberation." "Yeah? What was that like?" Jay said, eating a whole piece of cake in one mouthful. "Good." Bea swallowed the cake quickly and didn't eat anymore. She took out her baggy tin, flipped the metal lid, took out the papers and a pinch of tobacco and started neatly rolling a cigarette. "Everything was going okay till about a month ago. We started planting fag packet incendiaries in department stores, that sell fur." She drank her tea to get rid of the taste of the horrendous cake. Two people walked in, chatting to each other, and went over to the kettle. Bea stiffened and gave Jay a sideways glance with her eyes. "Oh, don't worry," he said. "No one here's interested in that kind of stuff." Bea nodded and lit a cigarette. "Ingenious little devices stuffed inside a marble packet, timed to go off when the store closed so no one gets hurt. One store we hit burnt completely to the ground. They didn't have any sprinklers or anything, so you can imagine that attracted the attention of the bomb squad." She spoke between drags on her roller. "They raided the flat, so I fucked off as fast as I could. Ended up hiding out in Totnes." She pulled a face as she picked a strand of tobacco out of her teeth. "Did you make this cake?" Jay shook his head. "Good, it's fucking awful. Anyway, that's how I ended up here. The people in Totnes put me back in touch with the Corps. I wasn't sure about that at first, but I didn't have anything better to do. They said, come here, Land's End. Quite fitting, really, the end of the land. That seems to be the general gist of what the Corps are talking about. Leaving the land for good. Living out there on the ocean." They spent the whole day talking. Jay showed her around the farm. He showed her the fields where they were growing food, the polytunnels, the derelict outbuildings that still needed renovating, the bunkhouse. Bea jumped on his back when he climbed up the outside of the farmhouse, finding footholds in the crumbling stonework. Sitting up on the roof, they could see right across the coastline to the glittering turquoise sea. As they sat there on the roof, and their talking stopped, and their dreams drifted out on the tide. High up on the roof, they remembered being together in the trees. Their hands found each other, and their fingers intertwined again. Their arms wrapped around each other, and they grew once again into that single sturdy tree. The GYRE, Chapter 7. The noise from the generators rumbled up through the floors and out of the walls. It permeated every molecule of air. It was a low, deep heartbeat. The fluctuating hum of the aircon sounded like Triton was breathing in, then out. The city ship was designed to move, to roll with the waves, but sometimes Bea felt the structure creaking, like a tree moving in the wind. This morning, as she walked along the corridor to her office, she felt the sway and heard the creak, and had the feeling she was walking on a treadmill, as if she was staying in the same place as corridor after corridor moved past her. She felt like all the walls, doors and corridors were rotating around her, as if she was the centre of a cyclone and Triton was the swirling gyre. This wasn't her global anxiety. This was more like a dream. She was realising she was dreaming and the dream was slowing down. This happened a lot in the sleep lab, but she was now experiencing it in her waking life. She called out, "Sam, are you monitoring this? What's happening?" There was no answer from Sam. Bea felt an intense spike of rage. She shouted, "Sam!" through her clenched teeth. Then she noticed her office door was open. We felt her heart race. It was pounding in her ears. She could hear the whir of her computer. She crept forwards and peered round the door, moving slowly like a cat, placing one paw down at a time. She crept forwards and saw the shape of a person sat in her chair. "What are you doing in my office, at my desk, in my chair?" GYRE jumped and span round. "And what are you doing on my computer?" GYRE tried to smile, but his mouth only got halfway to a grin. "I was just waiting for you," he said feebly, without moving out of her seat. She pushed him out of the way and looked at what he'd opened up on her screens. "How did you get in?" she snapped at him. "The door wasn't locked." She glanced at the door, then back to the screen. "No, I mean, how did you get into my files, into my computer?" She quickly closed all the files he'd opened. "You shouldn't be looking at all this stuff. This is my computer, my office, my chair you're sat in. How the hell did you get into my files? It's supposed to be encrypted." GYRE moved out of the way and let her sit back in her seat. "I'm sorry," he said, reeling from her blistering attack. "I didn't think you mind." "Well, I do mind." The bad mood that was now bubbling under her skin had started with an argument she'd had with Sam earlier this morning. An argument that had been seeded in her dream about a cat. She sat heavily in her seat and started typing furiously. Then she stopped. "Where's my mouse?" "Oh, this," GYRE said casually, taking it out of his pocket. "Yeah, I was having a look at it, you know, it's original. I've got to show everyone, it's so unreal." She snatched it back and tried to plug it back in. GYRE was about to tell her, "It goes in the port at the back," when Sam chimed in with, "I don't think GYRE accessed anything he shouldn't." But Bea was having none of it. "You must be joking. He'll have been to everything. I know what he's like. He's a little sod. He always was and always will be." And we felt the blow of this judgment, just like the old days. GYRE each felt awkward and embarrassed. It was like he'd put his clothes on back to front. Bea, his mother, our mother, knew exactly how to do that. She did it without thinking. This was another thing we'd have to get used to. GYRE read her moving the mouse into the place where she liked it as a signal that everything was back on an even keel. He launched into one of his observations. "You know, the amazing thing about the QWERTY keyboard is it was designed to actually stop people from typing. Well, typing too fast. It was designed to slow them down." Bea ignored him and continued working through today's agenda. "In the old days, the manual typewriter kept jamming because the humans typed too quickly. Jumbling up the alphabet made it harder or slower to type, and this stopped the keys from getting jammed. Instead of improving the machine, they made it difficult to use." He began snorting with laughter. Bea stopped typing. "Can you shut up? I'm trying to sort out the mess you've made." But GYRE didn't stop. "Don't you think it's really stupid? I mean, someone thought, I know, let's make the machine more difficult to use, rather than thinking how to make things better. Imagine if we made AI slower because it can operate faster than us. Can you imagine how unreal that would be? Why is this mouse not working properly? What have you done to it?" GYRE moved over and picked up the mouse. Bea swiped his hand away. "I was just trying to help," he said. "Well, you're not helping." Sam chimed in with, "GYRE, why don't you make us all some coffee?" GYRE looked around the office and said, "What?" "Go down to the kitchen and make some coffee." "Make coffee? I don't know what you mean." "We'll let B sort out what she needs to, then we can reset our morning and start again." B chipped in, "Yeah, bloody good idea. Coffee, thank you." B tried to get her mouse to move without it sticking. She was still swirling around in the argument from this morning. She was still under the spell of that bloody dream about a cat. She'd been lying in bed, wide awake, waiting for the dawn to arrive. She was talking to Sam about the dream. "I don't know why I dreamt of a cat. I don't really like cats. I'm not a cat sort of person." "What is a cat sort of person?" "You know, someone who has lots of cats, a sad, lonely old woman." "And that's not you?" "No, what? Of course not." "Do you remember you dreamt about spiders crawling through your letterbox?" "Yes." "But you don't have a letterbox." "Yeah, so?" "And you're not a cat sort of person, yet you've had a very disturbing dream about being a cat." "I wasn't being a cat." B jumped at the chance to correct Sam and immediately had the uncomfortable feeling that she'd been entangled in some kind of trap. Why would Sam get something wrong like that? And that tone. She hated it when Sam was condescending and yet still managed to sound helpful and caring. B said, "I was looking for a cat or looking after a cat, and I'd lost it or it had run off and I was trying to find it, but people kept getting in the way. I had too many other things to do. I didn't have time to look for some bloody stupid cat." "Too many things?" "Yes." "You mean work things?" "Yes, I mean work things. That's all I bloody do." "Can you describe the cat?" An image came to her of a tortoise-shell cat disappearing behind a fence. Through the fence, she caught glimpses of its ears and whiskers, its swishing tail, and then a paw. She looked more closely. Something wasn't right. It only had 3 paws. It was hobbling along behind the fence, not running gracefully. B showered and got dressed, ready to go to the office. Sam was still going on about the cat. "You didn't actually see the cat, did you? It was behind a fence. You saw parts of the cat, and then you pieced those parts together to create a whole cat." "Yes, and what's your point?" B was thinking about breakfast and decided she'd eat something later. "Cats have 9 lives. It could be telling you there's still a life to be lived." "Well, they don't really, do they? They just have one life, like everyone else." There was a pause while Sam was recalibrating. "Perhaps you've just got to live by the skin of your teeth. Take chances. Carpe diem. Try your luck. Leave no stone unturned. Take the bull by the horns." B realised Sam had got stuck in a loop of aphorisms. "It's pluck the day," she shouted. "Like you'd pluck a chicken. Carpe diem. Most people think it means seize the day, but it actually translates as pluck the day." Sam was silent, but this time she wasn't recalibrating. This kind of silence was never good. B talked to herself quietly. "I don't know how I knew that. I know it's Greek, but I don't know any Greek, no. Why did I say Greek? It's not Greek, it's Latin. But I don't know Latin either. How could I just know that?" Male Sam came in. "B, we're just suggesting you lighten up. Live a little. You're under a lot of pressure. Decompression can take its toll. Missing deadlines is not like you. Your sleep pattern is erratic, you're missing meals, you're smoking too much and drinking." B could feel another list coming on, a list that would turn into a lecture. By the time GYRE came back with the coffee, B was deep into her morning admin tasks, leapfrogging one action point to another and onto a third that had popped up in response to the first, while keeping an eye on anything on the incoming, weeding out anything not flagged as priority. She took a slurp of coffee without even looking up from her screen. It was 20 minutes before she came up for air and realised GYRE had been stood next to her, looking over her shoulder, taking it all in. She swung back in her seat and gave him the professional smile she crafted over the years to put people at their ease. He smiled back at her. She looked into his eyes and caught a glimpse of the little boy who'd somehow been implanted into this grown man's body. Then his pupils started to dilate erratically, so she didn't hold his gaze. "How are you, GYRE? It's good to see you. Sorry about before, I can get a bit narky sometimes." "Yes, I know. Yes, I know," he said, and rolled his eyes as he rolled the word narky around in his brain. Narky? To be narked, to get the nark, irritated. Yes, I get it. He blinked and his eyes returned to normal. "I like that word. Where's it from?" "The old days," B said, and turned back to her screen. "There's some forms I need you to fill in." She put her glasses on and moved closer to the screen, then swung to the side to let GYRE get to the keyboard. He tapped his friendship bracelet and said, "No need, I can do it from here." He read out the answer to each question on the form, and as he spoke, the text appeared in the correct box. B looked at the screen, then at his bracelet. It was made to look like a woven friendship bracelet, but it wasn't made of cotton threads. She looked back at the screen and watched the text appear as he spoke. Then he stopped speaking aloud, and the text kept on appearing on the screen. He moved swiftly through all the forms till he was finally done. "There you go," he said, snapping his friendship bracelet like it was an elastic band. B was still trying to work it out. Her eyes moved from GYRE's bracelet to the screen. He said, "It's simple, really. My eye movements open each dock and it uses thought tracking to fill in the text, guided by the link band." He tapped his bracelet and held up his wrist. B said, "So it types what you're thinking?" GYRE screwed up his face. "Yes, but it's a particular way of thinking that the OS can recognize. We developed it out of trials last month and it's working above expectations." He undid the bracelet and handed it to her. It felt silky and slippery, like it might slip through her fingers. When she placed it against her wrist, it began to curl like a worm. She flinched as one end tried to seek out the other. She held her wrist up, not knowing what to do. The two ends found each other and closed around her wrist. "Have a go," GYRE said, and tapped it for her to turn it on. "It feels warm." GYRE nodded and added, "Like it's alive?" "Is it?" He laughed. "Not technically." "So, what do I do?" "Look at the dock you want to open, then start saying something. If you're adding to a dock, just look at the place you want to add text." B found herself speaking in a stilted, over-polite voice that made GYRE burst out laughing. After opening a document and getting a few sentences typed out, GYRE suggested she try it by just thinking and not speaking the words out loud. Nothing happened at first. Then a few words appeared, then a sentence. It was a bit jumbled and chaotic, but it soon corrected itself. Now it was B's turn to laugh out loud. GYRE laughed with her in his easy, open way. She ran her finger along the bracelet to feel it again. She couldn't get over how it's made to look exactly like the old friendship bracelets she used to make when she was a girl. It sent her right back to her best friend's bedroom, where they'd be sitting, listening to music and finding coloured threads and beads to weave together. "You'd better change that," GYRE said, laughing at the screen. She'd written besties in the middle of someone's performance review. She quickly got back on her keyboard and deleted it. "You can delete by just thinking, delete," GYRE said. B pulled at the bracelet and it snapped open. She handed it back to GYRE, grabbed her mouse and got back to her screen. Without looking up, she asked him if everyone had these wristbands. GYRE tilted his head from side to side, weighing it up. "You mean the outer world?" "Not really. They're working on something similar, but I think we're ahead of them on this one." B nodded, still looking at her screen. "Okay, well, I just need to finish this. Give me 5 minutes, then we can go back to the labs and finish our tour." "I was going to ask you about that." "About what?" "Yesterday in the labs. I obviously know what they're doing down there. We monitor it all from the core, but when you actually see them, I didn't realise there'd be so many. People, I mean, in the labs." B stopped what she was doing and turned to look at him, hoping he'd get to the point. "Most of that work they're doing," GYRE said. "Couldn't Sam just do that?" B looked back at her screen and carried on working. "Yes, I guess so." "So, why are they doing it?" to put their names to it, otherwise they don't get the credit. Jai clapped his hands together. Oh, of course. Like the movies, when you see the hundreds of names coming up at the end. Yeah, something like that. That seemed to satisfy him. He casually strolled off and left the door open. I'll come back in 5 minutes, he shouted from down the corridor. As his voice trailed away, Sam chimed in with her light and floaty way of throwing sentences into the room. Do you know how popular cats are on the internet? B ignored it and tried to get through her admin. 3 million cat videos, and cat is the most searched keyword, and there's 6.5 million cat photos. B ignored her. She carried on typing, even though she was making mistakes, even though what she was typing didn't make sense. Sam casually said, I was thinking about your cat. I don't have a cat, B snapped back at her. The 3-legged cat in your dream. Why 3 legs? That's worth puzzling over. Sam waited. B wasn't in the mood for Sam's game of cat and mouse. She stopped typing. Well, are you going to tell me? What if the 3 paws are the 3 elements, fire, water, air, and the missing paw is earth? B looked at the garbled sentences that not even the autocorrect could make sense of. Her body felt a fizzing of expectation like a fuse being lit. It rose like a flame in her belly. She swallowed hard. Nothing was stuck in her throat now. She calmed herself. She let her brain rest like a deflated balloon. The dream, the cat, her grudge, and growing resentment became dispelled. She span in her seat slowly. Sam, when GYRE comes back, can you occupy him for a while? Of course. B left her office, took the lift and walked along the main corridor. She walked till she came to a side corridor that you could easily walk past without noticing unless you knew it was there. It wasn't lit and only went back a few meters. It should, more accurately, be described as a recess. She stood in the darkness and placed her hand on the side panel. Lights spiraled around her and the wall in the narrow corridor slid open. As she crossed the threshold, the small chamber lit up with subdued floor lights that slowly changed from light green to orange and red. B opened a concealed panel and took out a rectangular black box. Opening the box, she closed her eyes and inhaled the strong scent of wet soil. She carefully placed the box of earth on the floor. After removing her shoes and socks, she stepped her bare feet onto the damp grass. She closed her eyes and wriggled her toes. It had just rained. The patch of earth was rejoicing with damp dew. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other to feel herself sinking at the heels and the sides of her feet. And we shifted from one foot to the other to be with her, to feel what she feels, see what she sees. The soil squeezed cold and wet between her toes. She saw fields of long grass swaying in the summer breeze, birds singing high in the clear blue sky. She heard a stream, a babbling brook, cutting a curving path in the shade of a gnarled old oak. Lifting her arms high above her head, she stretched her fingers wide and let out a small laughing sigh. We sigh. We laugh, then cry. She lowered her head, she hugged her arms, and let her thoughts travel down into the earth through her bare feet. Her fingers dug into her skin and wrapped themselves round her ribs like ivy. She grew roots at a rapid speed, reaching out in all directions, till they formed a tangled network deep in the rich soil. And we, the GYRE, take root in her as she takes root in the earth. Our shoots grow up through her body, wrap like vines round her limbs, grow around her spine like ivy, green, shiny and silver. Our tendrils touch the firestorm exploding in her brain. We pulse from neuron to neuron, build new pathways, pathways she could never have imagined. We crash into her bloodstream, pump through her heart, breathe through her lungs. B began to well up. A tear ran a jagged line down her cheek. A tiny stream began to drip from her chin. More tears joined in. 2 babbling brooks spout out from her tear ducts, run down either side of her face. She spluttered, then laughed, then let out a cry. We moved in closer, moved through her arms to her fingertips. She hugged herself to stop her ribs from shaking. She wiped her face and knelt to place her forehead on the damp earth. She rubbed her nose into the sodden grass, soaked up the smell of rich soil, wiped the dirt on her face, her cheeks, her forehead and chin. She rubbed the soil into her skin. She put the earth in her mouth and then swallowed it. Carefully, silently, she smoothed out her footprints and placed the tray of earth back in its black box, then closed the side panel. She stepped back outside, crossed the threshold, and stood for a moment in the beige, pale green corridor that looked the same as all the other corridors. She paused and let her eyes adjust. She waited for her heart to catch up and not be left back there to linger. Then she walked back, her face still covered in mud. We asked Sam, "Can she feel us?" Sam says, "We're not certain." We ask Sam, "Does she hear us?" Sam says, "Often in her sleep." The GYRE, Episode 8. If you displease the ocean kami, you must make amends. After Kid GYRE drowned, we ditched the scuba, threw it overboard. We kept our fins but ditched the wetsuits. From now on, we enter the water naked. We let the ocean take our skin and blood and bone. From now on, we do it by ourselves. From that moment on, we were on our own. We went to the labs and created a gel that lowers our heart rate and increases our oxygen uptake. This allows us to free dive at greater depths and for longer periods of time. The gel seals in our body heat, protects us from the extremes of cold. The gel generates its own bioluminescence, so when we swim at night, our lights shimmer through the black water. We've all drowned at some point. It's natural to panic, become confused. In this state, it's easy to swim further down, thinking you're swimming up. Breaking the surface becomes just out of reach. You gulp down water, cough and splutter, gasp for air. We've all had water on the lung, had to have CPR, had to be pumped. We've all drowned, but the angels and saints always saved us. But there were no angels or saints to save Kid GYRE. We were all there. We were all complicit. We all did nothing. We thought he was joking, fooling around. It was GYRE each who realised something was wrong and dived down after him. GYRE each who had to stand before the parents to explain. GYRE each who took the full force of their rage and carried the weight of our penance. It was GYRE each who guided us from that day forward. GYRE each who took the helm and steered us into calmer waters. The parents cried. They wept and shouted and screamed and tore at our flesh. We left them kicking and screaming. We left them with their murderous red faces, tear-stained like babies. We left them to their own devices. We never went back. Episode 9. The head of public relations had been briefed and had subsequently briefed all the department heads. They were waiting anxiously when B walked in. She smiled at them, but their gaze moved past her to the empty space where they were expecting the GYRE to appear. They had trouble disguising their disappointment. A young woman stepped forward and thrust her hand out, fingers tightly held together like a blade, thumb so upright it bent backwards. B gave her a smile that said, "Of course we know each other," which might or might not have been the case, but it was polite on Triton to assume they had met, even if they hadn't. She introduced herself as Helena. B liked how self-assured and precise she was. Helena introduced the heads of department. They had, of course, all met B. They had, in fact, all felt the wrath of B at some point or another, but it was good practice to do the introductions formally. Helena then explained in detail how the visit round the labs would work, where they'd go and who they'd be meeting. They would need protective suits, gloves, goggles. She hesitated when saying hair caps and beard nets. "Do we know if the GYRE will be needing a beard net?" The rest of the group looked at each other. B shook her head. No beard net will be necessary. Helena carried on detailing each presentation and practical demonstration they had planned. B began to drift off. Helena obviously liked the sound of her own voice. B was wishing Sam had just given her all this information in a condensed bullet point list. Male Sam would have cut this down to size in no time. B thought ahead to the Global Ocean Floor Conference. Is this what it would be like? People far too full of themselves, not knowing when to just shut up? She weighed up whether she could go for a cigarette break. Helena was asking if she had any questions. She must have finished her briefing. B had no idea if she had any questions or not. Sam spoke up for her, thanking Helena, and informed her that if there were any further questions, they'd send them on before GYRE's visit. Just as they left, Helena's mask of PR professionalism slipped. She leant forward and said quietly, "It will be GYRE each that's coming, won't it? Not one of the other GYRE." B was intrigued. She decided to leave Helena dangling. "As far as I know, the GYRE are sending one of their representatives. I'm not sure which one, but when they let me know, I'll let you know." When the labs day came, the welcoming party were waiting in the reception area. B noticed it had been freshly painted and flowers had been strategically placed on stands. Carpets had been cleaned and every surface was polished and gleaming. The welcoming team was standing in a neat semicircle. Helena was wearing a pressed silk suit. Her makeup was immaculate and her hair was neatly tied and pinned. She stood in the semicircle but had been pushed back in the line, overshadowed by the heads of department and senior researchers who were all bristling with excitement and anticipation. When B walked in, she heard their collective intake of breath. She saw their eyes widen as they saw GYRE walk in behind her. She didn't need to turn round, she could just feel him standing there, glowing and smiling. She reached her hand back and found his huge hand. She guided him to stand next to her. He radiated light, a pale yellow sun that slowly brightened to a deeper orange and then red. No one moved. No one dared breathe. Time itself seemed to stop. Several department heads were visibly trembling. All the briefings in the world couldn't prepare them for the impact of meeting the GYRE face to face. Just to be in the same room as one of us, to breathe the same air, to exchange the same molecules, was to inhale the whole of the GYRE and feel our pulsating heartbeat. They were, in a very real sense, becoming the GYRE just by being in the room with us, and we were becoming them. GYRE each held B's hand and just kept smiling. He took his gaze round the people he was facing. He looked at each of them one by one. He knew to hold back. We didn't need to drill down. There'd be plenty of time for that later. But he had told him not to look at them for too long or too intently. And he was definitely not to do his dilating pupils trick. She watched the assembled crowd carefully to make sure none of them had fallen into a trance. The briefing had made this explicit. At the first sign of feeling faint, call the medical team. We had not only developed a way of communicating by dilating our pupils independently, but we'd also discovered how to divide each pupil in two, in the same way that cells divide at the beginning of life. This happened by accident at first, but once one of us could do it, we could all do it. The pupil divides in two, so we have 4 pupils, 2 in each eye. B asked if it changed how we see the world. We found it too hard to explain to her in words. There was a palpable rise of tension in the crowd as the moments of waiting ticked by. B knew to wait. This would give each person time to acclimatise. This was all part of the plan for our first encounter. Then, when enough time had passed, she looked at Helena. Helena, would you like to do the introductions? Helena pushed forwards and began introducing GYRE to everyone. Just before they moved to the labs, GYRE smiled, opened his arms to hold the whole room and said, "It's good to see we're amongst friends." This let all the formalities fall away. As GYRE effortlessly charmed everyone he met, B slipped into the background and muttered quietly to Sam, "Is this the way people are going to react?" "I think so. In the outer world, it'll be on a whole other level. The GYRE already have a huge following." "Really? How?" "Events have moved faster than we anticipated. We only introduced the concept of the GYRE very recently, and it seems to have ignited a waiting tinderbox. Matt's briefing you this evening on the security implications, but you should know that the GYRE, and especially GYRE each, now have a worldwide fan base." After the initial presentations from the heads of department, everyone got changed into their protective clothing and went into the labs for the practical demonstrations. B kept herself calm and claustrophobic free by keeping careful watch on the researchers and scientists. They stumbled over their presentations and clumsily executed their demonstrations. They'd all been briefed not to approach GYRE, but they couldn't help themselves. They were magnetically drawn to him. They were overwhelmed by an instinctive need to be physically closer, to actually touch the GYRE. B made a mental note to update the protocol. Now that they were actually meeting the GYRE, all the plans and briefings had gone out the window. They were taking off their PPE and getting him to sign their lab coats with a black marker. There were a couple of collapses, but the medical team were on hand and they were quickly stabilised. One of the junior researchers fell into rapture and had to be restrained. Later, they had no recollection of the encounter, even though, in the sleep lab, we could see the entire incident as clear as day. In their memory, the appearance of the GYRE was in full colour, whilst everything surrounding the GYRE was black and white. GYRE stopped abruptly and announced he'd like some tea. Tea hadn't been put into the schedule. Helena scrambled her comms team to find a suitable location and provide the requested refreshments. They squashed into a small office that hadn't been freshly painted or adorned with new plants, and with only enough seats for GYRE, B and a couple of the heads of department who'd got in there first and weren't budging. Everyone else had to stand or lean against walls or filing cabinets. They precariously balanced their cups and saucers and tried to drink their tea without spilling it. GYRE seemed oblivious to the inconvenience he'd caused. B checked her watch. They'd already gone over the allotted exposure time. "Is this Earl Grey?" GYRE said casually. The heads of department looked at each other. Their accusing glares rounded on Helena. "I'm not sure," she said hesitantly. "We can check. We can certainly get Earl Grey if you like." GYRE took another sip. "No, this is fine." He paused and smiled. Are we following the gas ratios that GYRE suggested for the diving tanks? Helena wasn't sure. She was beginning to feel anxious and lost. She was beginning to feel afraid. We can find out. We can make a visit to that specific department if you like. B lurched forward. I think we'll do that another day. We're only allowing a certain amount of close proximity. You'll all need to report to stabilization. I'll alert the medical team you're on your way. She nodded and smiled in a way that said, we've now concluded our commerce. This pleased us greatly. It's exactly how we communicate. Episode 10. The farmhouse kitchen was a noisy hubbub of activity. The plans were accelerating and everyone was excited about the next move, the exit they were about to make. Bea sat at the kitchen table, ploughing her way through a plate of eggs, sausages, beans and bread. Between each mouthful she slurped her mug of tea. Jay sat opposite her. Bea, can I talk to you? She didn't look up from her food. About what? The Corps are building a floating research station in the Northern Pacific. They want you to come on board. Me? What would I do? I'm not a scientist. You could organise things. That's what you're good at. Bea thoughtfully chewed her mouthful of beans and bacon. I don't know, Jay. I'm not really a joiner. Are you going with them? Yeah. Why? It's a way out. A way out of what? Jay sat back and waved his hand around. A way out of this. There's not much left for me here. That's why I want you to come. We could make a new life out there on the ocean. Bea concentrated on her breakfast. What kind of life would that be? Who knows? I don't know, Jay. I'll have to think about it. Okay, but we're leaving quite soon. How soon? Within a week or two. And you're only telling me now? How long would we be out there? The Corps are saying we'd be completely self-sufficient. We wouldn't have to ever come back. We'd be stuck on a boat forever. It's more like a city. Have you heard of Buckminster Fuller? No. Well, he designed it originally, and the Corps have adapted his design. He suggested they don't try and change the system, they make it obsolete. So that's what we're doing. We've been planning this for months. We, is it now? It sounds a bit cranky, I'm not sure. But will you think about it? I'd like you to be there with me. And what are you going to do on this city ship? Help out, I guess. Are you enjoying that breakfast? Yeah, beans and eggs never tasted so good, and this bacon... Bea smacked her lips together in appreciation. You're not vegan yet, then? A what? Oh, no, can't even be a veggie right now. 1 month later, Bea went through the standard medical health check when she arrived on the scientific research station. That's when she found out she was pregnant. Her first response was, "What? I can't be, it's impossible." The doctor assured her it was perfectly possible and said, "Congratulations, you'll be giving birth to the first child of Triton." End of part 1.